the trial of Jesus before Pilate, I ask that your Holy Spirit give us a clear understanding and insight into the depravity of human nature as it seeks to keep its power. In Jesus' name, amen. We're 3 weeks away from Easter, and we're journeying with Jesus through Mark's Gospel as he goes through the last harrowing 24 hours of his life. 24 hours during which he is betrayed by a supposed friend and chosen disciple, where the rest run away or deny him, and where he is at the mercy of jealous and corrupt religious officials intent on his death, where justice and due process are totally ignored, and where he will be beaten to within an inch of his life before finally being taken and essentially murdered in one of the most horrendous ways possible. And incredibly, even though Jesus knew all of this was coming, he didn't run away. He allowed it to happen because he knew that it was the only possible way that humanity could be reconciled to God, their creator. It's an incredible story of a man's fortitude, of our Creator's fortitude, in allowing himself to go through this horrendous series of events, because it was the only way possible that you and I, the whole of humanity, can be reconciled to our Creator. We left off last time with Jesus' arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane. A hateful mob stirred up by the jealous religious authorities have seized Jesus and they've led him away, first to Annas, the previous high priest, and then to the palace of Caiaphas, the current high priest, to be questioned, or more accurately, interrogated. Now, Caiaphas is an interesting guy. He's the current high priest. He was appointed by Valerius Gratus, the previous Roman prefect, the one before Pontius Pilate. And as we've noted before, when we've talked about the high priest system, we noticed that it was they who controlled the temple, and along with the Sadducees exert a lot of influence in the Sanhedrin, the Jewish equivalent of a parliament. Now, the high priests that we know have been running a number of scams to separate people from their money. They have exorbitant and unavoidable exchange rates that people have to pay a certain amount in order to get the temple tax and the temple currency, in order their annual kind of like tax every year. They have exclusive monopolies on the sale of sacrificial animals that bring in too the equivalent of millions of dollars, it's been estimated. And these people, these high priests, are jealous of Jesus and his popularity. And like many people with power and authority, they are afraid that Jesus is going to undermine their position. And specifically, that if people no longer feel they have to go to the temple to connect with God, then they stand to lose not just huge sums of money, but also power and influence over the people as well. And they are so corrupt. These people are so corrupt that they are not afraid to stoop to murder in order to protect their interests. It's horrendous. It's worth noting that the previous high priest, Annas, is Caiaphas' father-in-law. So he appoints his own son-in-law into the position when he was deposed. And besides Caiaphas, in the end, 5 of Annas' own sons actually have the role of high priest in sequence, one after another. It's essentially a family business. That Jesus is taken to Annas first as a mark of who really wields the power. And interestingly, Annas is still high priest because he doesn't lose his title or status even after he steps down from and Caiaphas is appointed. He's kind of like the Don in a mafia family. And sadly, this level of corruption, nepotism, where you appoint family members to positions of influence and power, and this desire to hold on to political power is a common story all around the world today, even today, both in secular and religious systems. And almost inevitably, the fear of losing your power and all that comes with it leads many to act illegally and immorally, where election fraud, intimidation, the abuse of power, where you try and change a constitution. We've seen that happen in Zimbabwe and Turkey. You do all of these kind of things to keep you in power. Murder, beatings, torture are all commonplace around our world today. It's all part and parcel of the effects of human sinfulness that Jesus is seeking to fix, actually, with his coming to earth. But back to the story. Finally, after hours of false testimony and trying to conjure up some form of charge that they could make stick against Jesus, the high priest asks, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" To which Jesus finally replies, Yes, I am. And you will see the Son of God, Son of Man, coming on the clouds with power. And at that point, the high priest dramatically stands up. He tears his robes and shouts, "Why do we have a need for any more witnesses? You've heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" And the whole Sanhedrin, or those who were gathered there, condemned him as worthy of death. Now, it's actually at this point probably 3 or 4 in the morning. It's quite late or early. And the decision is made now to take Jesus to Pilate. And this is interesting on a couple of levels. Firstly, because the text tells us that the whole Sanhedrin agreed to this decision. But I know, and probably you do as well, that many of the Pharisees, like Gamaliel, Joseph of Arimathea, and others, would not have agreed with this decision. I strongly suspect, given that the meeting was called late at night, because it was held at the high priest's palace, that not actually the whole Sanhedrin was there, just a select chosen few, enough in number and feeling pressured because of the environment to make a decision seem like that of the whole body. This was a setup. Secondly, why did they take Jesus to Pilate? The Jews actually did have authority to execute people according to their religious law. Remember the stoning of Stephen, the stoning or attempted stoning of the woman caught in adultery. But it was only according to religious offences. Why didn't they just carry out the execution that they just agreed on? Well, maybe they were afraid of the people. Maybe they were afraid of what might happen if they tried to enact their verdict. They could be faced with an uprising where their whole power base would come tumbling down and it would all be over for them. So they decide to make Rome enact the decision and Pilate their patsy. But Pilate won't be interested in a religious charge, so the charge of blasphemy has to be substituted for another one. Luke 23 verse 1 states it very boldly when he writes, "A multitude of people then led Jesus to Pilate and pronounced different charges, saying, 'We have found this fellow perverting the nation, forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar.'" Well, that's a lie, because he said, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God." So it's a lie. And saying that he himself is Christ, a king. Now, treason is a charge Pilate, as Roman governor, has to take seriously, and one which does mean the death penalty. But as he listens to the arguments, he realises that Jesus has done nothing deserving of death, and that the charge of treason is flimsy at best. But he's trapped as well. Pilate depends on maintaining good relationships with the civil and religious authorities of Israel, because it actually helps him to govern and maintain law and order and peace. And obviously these folk want Jesus killed. But Pilate is not totally without morals, and so he tries to deflect the situation. He discovers that Jesus is actually from Galilee, and Herod is in town at the moment visiting, so he says, "I'll send him to Herod." So he sends him off to Herod to try and avoid taking responsibility. Herod questions Jesus. Jesus doesn't say much, and so Herod just thinks, well, I'm not really going for this. I'm not going to be the patsy, and sends him back to Pilate. Pilate then decides to play to the crowd and to see if they would support him releasing Jesus over Barabbas as a way of giving himself an out. But the crowd is under the influence of the high priests, and they call for Barabbas, which means that Pilate has kind of worked himself into a corner. He's trapped himself. And you can see this frustration in his words. Verse 12, "What shall I do then with the one that you call the King of the Jews?" "Crucify him," they shouted. And then Pilate says again, "But why? What crime has he committed?" You can see his frustration, can't you? But they shouted just all the louder, "Crucify him, crucify him." And in the end, as we know, Pilate just washes his hands of the whole affair and hands Jesus over to be crucified. An innocent man, one he knows to be innocent. He has been weak, and he has allowed himself to be manipulated into killing an innocent person. Such is the price of politics and power. I'm just going to skip a little bit because of time. In so many ways, the trial and judgment of Jesus was shown to be a kangaroo court, something that tried to give the appearance of legality, but which was totally lacking in justice, fairness, and morality. Well spoken are the words of the prophet Isaiah. "By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgressions of my people. And they made his grave with the wicked and with a rich man in his death, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth." It's part of Isaiah's third servant song. It's one of a series of 4 prophetic writings in the book of Isaiah that predict the coming of one called the servant, who actually is Jesus Christ. And it perfectly matches him. They made his grave with the wicked. He was crucified with 2 criminals. And then with a rich man in his death, he was buried in the rich Pharisee's grave of Joseph of Arimathea, although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth. Have you ever been in a position of power where you have been tempted to abuse that power for your own advantage? And it can happen in so many ways. You're appointed to a voluntary committee that makes grants to the local community. You have applications coming before you from groups who do similar work to you. How do you engage in the debate? Do you excuse yourself, declare a conflict of interest? Or do you subtly diminish their work in the eyes of others, sow seeds of doubt so as to reduce the level of grant that they might receive so that you might get more? Or do you work in a place where you have a level of power over other employees? Do you abuse that power to get what you want? Or do you behave in ways not appropriate? And that's where so much of the sexual harassment that happens in our workplaces actually begins, because people are in positions of power over others and they subtly start to use that power, and because the other person is, in a sense, subservient in a way, they are afraid to speak up. Or do you have a level of responsibility at work over consents, contracts, ordering, which allows you to favour some over others? Nikki and I have friends whose house was built by a builder who gained a consent for an unstable section in Christchurch simply because he knew the council officer issuing the consents. A rock came down the hill that was the size of a small room and smashed into the house where their bedroom was. They would have been killed if they'd been there at that time. That's the reason we have consents. The geological survey said you should not build a house on that section, but the builder knew the consenting officer and he said, "Oh, she'll be right." Do you have specialty knowledge maybe, allowing you to take advantage of others? Are you a mechanic, for example, who can with a few words present a case for repairs that simply do not need to be done? Power comes to us in so many ways. It can be through knowledge, position, responsibility, reputation, access to resources, but with it comes responsibility. It's so easy to be seduced into thinking that the power is yours as of right, and therefore you can do what you like with it. And it never usually starts off with big transgressions, but just with small steps that then embolden you to make bigger ones, until finally you find yourself in a place that you never could have imagined. I suspect we can all think of situations and times where we have been abused, ripped off, scammed and taken advantage of or disadvantaged by someone in that position of power. We can readily identify with the feelings that come of anger, helplessness and the sense of injustice and unfairness. But more important is to consider the times when we might have been the one with the power and maybe use that inappropriately. And I want to finish by just asking that we just pause for a moment and close our eyes and take a moment to look back over our lives and to see if there ever has been an incident where you have acted in a way where you have abused the power that you happen to hold in your hands. And if you have, take a moment to bring that before God now in a time of prayer, and then we'll close with a confession. Let's just pray and pause.